So yeah, I'll kick us off. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is the first ever our Validation Hub Risk Tools Developer Day. It's a little bit of an experiment this year. So we're trying to um, get this a little more kind of like do a little more community engagement, be a little bit more kind of intentional about each year and what we want to achieve each year and getting the community pulled in for that discussion. So this is intended to be really interactive. There's some challenges with the organizing and just trying to do the moderation for a group this large. So we'll get to kind of the logistics of what that engagement will look like in just a bit. But thank you all for joining. I think it's really exciting to see how much community enthusiasm there is for these sets of tools. We're going to be hearing from people that are adopting or evolving the landscape of these tools, and we'll use that as kind of like an impetus to drive some developer discussion about what we want this to be in the future. So first and foremost, welcome. This is our first ever R Validation Hub Developer Day, so we get to cut the ribbon on this event and kick ourselves off. If this goes well, this is something that I'd really like to make a more kind of like a common occurrence. So maybe every year we kind of organize something that tries to bring people in, is a good on-ramp for new contributors, and is kind of like the pathway to getting more engaged. So that's if this goes well, hopefully, fingers crossed, this is something we see more of in the future. I wanted to kind of prime everyone a little bit with what you can expect. So first and foremost, if you're not already familiar with kind of the details of all of the risk tools, the R Validation Hub products, then you'll learn more about our software products. I hope that there's a little bit of connection happening here. So definitely drop questions in chat, raise your hand, all that good stuff. Let's kind of get people talking and trying to figure out where people are coming from, where are the skill sets, and how can we kind of like leverage each other to push things forward. This is a great opportunity to ideate, to be the impetus for the changes that we want to see in this software. So we have a lot of our developers on the call, namely a lot of the leads of our different work streams. So I'll call out a few people. Colin leads our repositories work stream, the newest of our work streams. Eric Milliman leads our risk metric work stream. We have Aaron Clark, and I'm not sure if I saw Jeff Thompson yet on the call, but Jeff Thompson, I think, will be joining us shortly, leading the risk assessment Shiny app. So this is a great opportunity just to interact with them in person, get to hear how they think about their tools and what they want to see as the landscape of the development. So just a good opportunity to kind of bring the community together. Of course, that gives you the opportunity to shape the work that we'll be doing and kickstart your own participation. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of these familiar names or having all of your names become familiar by next year. So I wanted to emphasize, like, why are we here? And so first and foremost, and when I say we, I'm talking primarily about our Validation Hub, and I hope I'm speaking for you as well, that we love community projects. And we think that that is really the best forum for cross-industry collaboration and for really making the most effective use of all of our effort. We recognize that being a strong community project requires conscious and active community participation. So both on our part and if you're a new contributor, that also is probably a responsibility of everyone involved. We want to improve our community, and we want to empower ourselves to achieve an ambitious goal. And part of that is bringing the community together to have these discussions. So that's, in my eyes, what is really what I'm trying to take away from this. So thank you all again for being here, and hopefully we can realize these goals. I did have a couple of tips, so we're going to try to keep this interactive where we can. So keep in mind as you're engaging with the products and sharing your thoughts, first, keep a positive spirit. And of course, we have Casper the Friendly Ghost here to remind us to be a positive spirit. So be ambitious, encouraging, and defer judgment. So if your impulse is that something you're not seeing the value of a proposed idea, or you're not, whatever it is, any kind of like more negative sentiments, try to reframe that in a more positive way, keep the conversation moving forward in a way that kind of like steers the discussion in a productive direction. And so that's not to say that you can't, represent an opinion that might have been not considered or needs to be taken into account, but try to reframe it in a way that's at least driving the conversation in a productive direction. Get Spirited Away. So here we have no face from the movie Spirited Away, and they're reminding us to be encouraging and expand on exciting ideas. So get excited, allow yourself to kind of like lean into your excitement and riff on ideas as they're coming up. So just a reminder for that. And the spookiest of the ghosts, this is a shot from The Exorcist, but they're reminding us to get it out. So if you have ideas, I don't think everyone's going to be able to probably use like the audio channel necessarily to say all those ideas, but get them into the chat. We'll then kind of back up the chat and try to collect all the ideas from there. Get them out somewhere. Maybe just jot down notes on your own. You can email me afterwards, but as things are coming up, if you just have ideas, get them down somewhere, and then we'll assemble all of those. So whatever your ideas are, share them if they're something that's going to drive the conversation, but most importantly, just get them somewhere, and then we can comb through those after the fact and try to aggregate everything into something that will materialize productively. Before we begin, I wanted to do a little kind of like testing of which mechanisms we have for actually playing with our platform here. So this is our tool for today for having a developer day, and it's worth kind of trying out some of the mechanisms we have of communicating. So if can everyone chat? I'm not sure what the restrictions are on the call itself. Maybe everyone could just try to drop a hi in the chat. I'm seeing highs from the people that have been, okay, cool. So I think some people that haven't been explicitly given permission are also able to chat. That's good. Can people use the emoji reactions to kind of add a little flavor to the discussion? Cool, I'm seeing some. And I think the way that we're going to handle talking today, there's a few people that are considered panelists for today that will be able to take themselves off mute. But for most people on the call today, if you do want to talk, you'll have to raise your hand, and one of our moderators will give you permission then to talk. And that's just a way of kind of keeping the mechanisms of communication a little bit controlled for something that does go out to like a public invite and all that kind of stuff. So just to kind of keep the moderator's job not to be too crazy trying to monitor a whole room of people. And then just following through with a little bit of an agenda. So some background for today. We're already kind of working our way through that. We're going to talk about a little bit about the current state of our tools. And then we're going to talk about imagining what transformation looks like of our products. We're going to hear from 3 different pioneering adopters to hear either things that they've been excited about the risk tools, things that they had to do slightly differently, or inspiration that they've taken from those tools. And we'll use that feedback to kind of like steer what we could do to either bring a lot of these interests together or adopt some of the ideas that they've been able to implement as they've kind of been charging ahead. We'll leave the majority of the time for discussion. So the goal here is that this really becomes kind of an open forum for us to chat about what we want this to be, how we want things to change, what we want that to look like moving forward. I put together, I think I can share my screen. So we have this kind of like whiteboard that everyone will be able to join in a bit. And we'll be able to kind of mock up ideas about what we're looking for in the future of the risk tools. And we'll use that, we'll collect all this information. We'll use that as kind of impetus for us to then consider what we want things to look like moving forward. But that will be how we'll be aggregating everyone's feedback. So depending on your level of comfort, you're welcome to come off of mute with the moderator's permission and kind of discuss some things that you're throwing on this whiteboard. But also, if you don't necessarily see yourself as someone who wants to be really vocal through this process, you can kind of more passively be just populating that whiteboard, and that'll be a great way to get ideas on paper. So we'll come to that in a bit. And then finally, we'll have a discussion around next steps. How do we keep this momentum going forward? So that can be things like if you're a developer and you're excited to get some features going, that's awesome. We can talk about what that development looks like. I also want to focus on kind of the non-development aspects of maintaining a community project. So this is how do we encourage new contributors, and how do we maybe bolster the maintenance of these tools to kind of make it more accessible and more communicative. So we'll get to all of that toward the end of the discussion. Cool. So I'm going to give a little bit of background first about the state of our tools and really the motivation for why we wanted to host this. So even before this past year, the past 5 or so years, I'd say the R validation hub was very much like spearheading a cultural shift in the way that the pharmaceutical ecosystem was adopting R. And what that meant is that a lot of the people involved in these projects were kind of at the bleeding edge. They were really theorizing what this could look like, and they were using software as a way of communicating those goals. Where we're at now is that the industry has really done a lot of catching up, I think. So this isn't necessarily a pioneering activity. This is now kind of like the day-to-day activity and the day-to-day requirements that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are looking for. And with that comes kind of a shift in the tone that the projects need to take. So I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about how we started these projects. So Risk Metric, I think, was started 5 or more years ago. And at the time, the goals were very different. We started by building a tool that would support the advocacy of the use of R, not necessarily the explicit adoption or rigid administration of R. We really preferred simplicity. At the time, different organizations' level of skill with R was spanned a very wide spectrum. And because it spanned a wide spectrum, we knew that there'd be people that probably didn't know how to manage things like different repositories, or wouldn't be able to necessarily robustly install packages all the time to just assess kind of like whether or not a package would be a good candidate for them to use in their work. And so because those like fairly fundamental skills were not necessarily always there, we really prioritize things like ideally being able to pull some risk metrics out of the box without a whole lot of legwork. These days, that story is very different. So I think now those kind of core competencies of using R can be assumed to be there, in at least with most of the pharma companies that I'm talking to. And what that means is that the expectations look different. People actually, the simplicity that we set out to provide is now kind of like a detracting feature. It's something that people are trying to avoid. They want it to be this lockdown, very precise tool that goes out and grabs very specific metrics that are fully reproducible and highly configured. So just to emphasize that the user story has kind of changed in the course of this product. At the time that we were building it, the primary user story was for data scientists or statisticians or analysts that might need to convince a system administrator that they wanted to use some R package. And so we kind of needed to build tools that allow someone that isn't necessarily a system administrator to make that case. These days, I think the story is a little flipped. I think at this point, most companies have at least some kind of like infrastructural support for R. And because of that, now people want this kind of like production grade R environment. And what that means is that the user story has shifted now toward more the administration of R and not necessarily the advocacy of R. So I wanted to also back up and give like a state of our risk tools. And you'll see a few of these folks on the call. So look out for these names in the invite list. These are the people to ask questions to that are very closely connected to each of these individual projects. So Eric leads risk metric, Aaron and Jeff lead risk assessment, and Colin leads the repository working group. And for now, we have these 3 software products. That's worked really well. They've kind of grown into their own entities. They have their own kind of scopes, and they're pretty well split up into the like separate initiatives. However, as they've matured, the scope of each has grown pretty considerably. So risk metric, in addition to providing like quantifiable qualities of packages, it also now has some tools, or even from the start, it had some tools for kind of scoring packages and aggregating scores. And that was kind of ambitious and wasn't necessarily intended to be like the de facto standard for how we would score packages. It was kind of intended more to be an example that people could leverage and see how that scoring could happen. But kind of at the end of the day, what we've seen is that most companies come back to us with feedback saying that like the scoring mechanism needs to change because it's not capturing some criteria or something. And so really what people are looking for is like governance. I'm not sure if you can see let me get the laser pointer going. So really what people are looking for is like governance. And so a lot of the issues that we see, a lot of them are bugs, but also a lot of them are these types of things about governance where there's some concern over how some score is being evaluated. And really that's not a decision that we want to be living within our software package. So it's kind of this accessory behavior. Likewise, risk assessment implemented this really cool UI for kind of characterizing your own little decision tree or logic for how you want to start categorizing packages into like a low, medium, or high risk kind of category. And that starts to look very much like risk metrics scoring. So that there's a little bit of redundancy going on there. Risk assessment also has this cool feature for generating reports. And so even the scope here has kind of like grown beyond just being a Shiny app. It's now kind of doing its own thing. There's a little bit of redundancy here. Likewise, the repository working group, this isn't explicitly a software product. It's more of like a service, but it's already dabbling in these things as well. So likewise, we've shown this demo where we're filtering a repository on some kind of package criteria. And that criteria is starting to look very similar to the risk assessment criteria or the scoring mechanism in risk metric. And each of these now kind of has this little implementation of the same feature. Similarly, we're borrowing very heavily from the risk assessment reporting tools because we want reports that get spit out of this service. And likewise, because we have this flow chart and we have to decide on something that's considered an industry standard, we're doing this governance work as well. So unsurprisingly, you can see that there's redundancy in this feature set across all of these. And what we would like to do is to start splitting these up into more kind of thoughtfully delineated projects. And specifically in risk metric, I wanted to draw attention to this fact that like this redundancy has really been the crux of the challenge that we've been facing with trying to administer this as a project. Because we're starting to mix what is like a very developer skill set doing package development with what is ultimately like a governance decision that might fall more appropriately with a validation lead or with discussions with regulators. A lot of that means that this becomes a really difficult project to maintain or be a steward for this project. So risk metric, Eric in particular, he's really done a lot of amazing work to help kind of usher through a lot of the governance discussions. But I know that that's taxing because I'm a developer too. I know that I like doing R package development and I like solving technical problems, and to be pulled away from that to be discussing very like business-oriented decisions constantly detracts from what is or isn't a technical problem. It's sometimes difficult to kind of delineate those two when someone reports a bug or something like that, and to be having to juggle like what is the right place for this problem to be solved. So for a while now, we've been taking, the governance shaped problem and we keep putting it in the package shaped hole. And I think that that's really made this a really difficult project for specifically Eric, but I think all of us kind of feel this this challenge of kind of trying to not have those two things be totally separated. So where we're hoping to go is that we'd like to propose a different direction where we are more intentional about keeping these things separate and reusable across the different tools. And specifically, this governance piece, we'd like to tease out and devote non-developers to, get more people involved that aren't necessarily our package developers, that can start having the discussions about like what does good quality software look like? Maybe work with some developers to frame that in terms of what these qualities should look like. They can then inform teams like RiskMetric to tease out that information and make it available. So this is something that we've been thinking about within the development teams for a little bit now. And we'd like to use this as kind of like the basis for how we want to be conceptualizing the tools moving forward. So just to put some finer points on these, if we, by splitting off the decision-making aspect of this, we want to reinforce a renewed focus on quantifiable package qualities, possibly sunset the decision-making features, or maybe like wind them down, deprecate. Exactly what that lifecycle management looks like, we can work that out, but not make that necessarily the focus of this package moving forward. Reconsidering our target audience. So like I mentioned, initially we were targeting kind of junior analysts, senior analysts, and now we want to shift more towards targeting kind of a system administrator or maybe even the validation lead. And maybe the validation leads kind of live more in this governance group if that's something we choose to set up. Likewise, things like this reporting package, if that's how the form that this ends up taking, that ends up being kind of like a deduplicated piece of code that can be reused over and over again. So there's no, it has a cohesive look and feel for all the reports that get generated from either of these different products, but then also the code doesn't need to be duplicated. So just where it's sensible, trying to make reuse code. And then finally, the non-R package piece of this governance structure, trying to really make the process the focus. So dedicate people whose responsibilities are to be working with health authorities, working with pharmas or CROs to think about what the validation process should look like at each of those institutions, and starting to codify that in something that we can then support through tools like RiskMetric. So that gives us a clear connection with regulators, and really serve as the liaison between the regulators and the developers. And then hopefully incorporating roles that have been kind of underrepresented today, people like validation leads and submission experts. So these are, occasionally we get these folks cycling through some of our products. And I think in the past, they've kind of bounced off because a lot of our products end up being very technical. And those are conversations that are difficult, I think, to kind of sit through. If that's not your expertise, it's a lot of jargon that isn't particularly relevant. So we really need a team that kind of works to exercise these skills. So we're going to hop over into a series of 3 talks now from a few guest speakers. And they're going to walk us through their experience either using RiskMetric or not using RiskMetric, and what alternatives look like. And we're going to try to take from those conversations feedback that we can use then to direct the way that we want RiskMetric to evolve. So I'm going to hand it over first to Colin. So I can stop sharing. Colin, if you want to share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Doug?
Yeah, can hear you great.
Thank you. So you should be able to see my screen okay. Great. Thank you for the introduction, Doug. So I don't have many slides, but the general idea is we've been working with a few clients who are interested in this validation as a service, and I'm going to prefix this as an open source service that I'll discuss a bit more. So to set the scene of where we are as a company, we do a lot of managed infrastructure. So we set up a lot of our infrastructure, Python infrastructure, for clients, not just in the pharma space, but throughout. And everyone's got a different risk appetite depending on who they are. So if you're in the happy place of students, then you don't really care. You just install any old stuff. And I'm also a little bit of an academic, and academics are somewhat the same. You know, it just has to sort of work today. We don't really bother too much. Startups, they're trying to make money, so the risk appetite is they might want to be right over to the right hand side, but in practice they're not. But then we've got government who sits somewhere in the middle, and then we've got more regulated industries, you know, finance and then pharmaceuticals, you know, us here today. And they all want to use R, and they all have different risk appetites. And really, risk appetites is essentially a proxy for how much time, effort, i.e. money, do they want to invest in this. So whilst everybody wants to be risk-free, it's how much time and effort. And on top of that, we've then thought, well, we've got validation and demand, whereas governments, startups just want something sensible, for some meaning of the word sensible, whereas people in finance, pharmaceuticals, and some parts of governments might want something really tight, validated environments, you know, dot the I's, cross the T's, that sort of idea. So when I'm going through these next few slides, this is the idea that we are coming at it from Jumping River. So it's not just pharmaceuticals, it's also thinking about this idea of validation as a service. And that impacts how we do things, because in order to make it effective for governments, startups, and some financial institutions to use validated packages, it has to be quite slick, it has to be quite fast, and quite cost effective if we're blunt. So we're going to be talking about something called Litmus. This was essentially risk metrics, and we had a client who asked us, well, we would like some help with validation. And the client was really, really nice. They said, we actually would like this stuff to be open source at the end of the project, so that'll be happening later. And the initial plan was, well, we would make a few MRs to risk metric. We were planning to do that at the end of the project because we have a deadline, so it's not fair to say, please merge this thing now. You know, we must have this merged within 24 hours. That's not reasonable. So initial plan was a few MRs, but then it sort of became more a fork as we changed things, and now it's become a distant fork. So you can see similarities between Litmus and Riskmetric, but it's different. It's sufficiently different that it's not a drop-in. It would require some pain and suffering. And we aim to open source all this stuff in early next year, or this package. So what are the differences? So I was chatting with Doug yesterday, and he asked me to explain what are the differences with Litmus versus Riskmetric. So we have round about 600 unit tests with coverage round about 99.5%. And that 0.5% annoys me something awful. And Doug very helpfully helped me work through where that 0.5% is, and I can delete that bit of code. So we have almost complete unit tests. And we've taken the view that when we're validating packages, we are not forgiving in any way, shape, or form. We do not give things the benefit of the doubt. We automatically go to error mode. We raise errors, well, scream. And that's why there's lots of tests, because every time something breaks, we fix it in the code, we add a test, and on it goes. And we've also separated out the scores to a separate package, which was something that Doug sort of hinted at or touched on. And we stole this idea from conversations with Doug and other people in the risk metrics community. So just now we've got Litmus that looks to assess, and then we've got scores as a separate package. So for example, the Litmus package would allow you to check downloads, but then the scores package would then allow you to do whatever you want with those downloads, whether you want to work out the median or the mean over the last year, over the last 2 years. So we separated out those two ideas. We've been incredibly strict, so we've stripped out a lot of niceness. So we can only assess a source or installed package. Okay, so we're not going to try and guess if it's on CRAN. We're not going to try and guess if it's on Bioconductor or anything like that. Is it installed? And if it's not installed, can you point me to this tar GZ? Okay. And the source code must always be available for installed packages. So we must be able to download that tar GZ. Why? Because validation is important. And so there's no guessing. There's no sort of hinting at what we're going. We've documented in code anything that raises an NA. So some of the metrics or some of the assessments can raise an NA, and other metrics in theory shouldn't be able to use an NA. And so unexpected missing values raise errors, right? So we've got a way of documenting in code what we expect may produce an NA, and then if we get an unexpected NA, that automatically raises an error. Likewise, things like null, not a number, anything like that automatically raises an error. Again, coming from that very strict point of view. We've got lots of logging, so we're using the logger, very strict unit tests, scores decoupled from assessments. Okay. We're going for no ambiguity, so we have to pass explicit repositories to the package. We don't try to be nice and install any dependencies. Instead, the package will say, actually, we can't run this test because this hasn't run or this isn't installed. Please install it. And again, the idea behind that is the user should know exactly what versions are installed in the package. And so the package shouldn't try to guess anything. So it's always going from that mindset of everything has to be explicit, everything has to be installed, everything has to be sorted. Again, there's little helper functions to help the user install the right thing, but the package by itself doesn't have any ambiguity. It always has to be explicit. Okay, so those are the main differences. One similarity, and I had a conversation with Doug yesterday of, if you're familiar with risk metric, it uses some, which I've both thought Doug was and the other authors of risk metric have both been a genius and then an evil genius, depending which point of view I'm going at. But the way it's structured is there's a lot of lists going on. And could it be some other structure? Well, actually, one of the benefits of lists is when we export the output of Litmus, it's really easy to understand. It doesn't require anything fancy. So we've maintained the core structure. So the core structure of Litmus is very similar to the core structure of risk metric. And that's got its upsides and downsides. So downside, it's perhaps could be a bit better internally. Upside, exporting this stuff is really easy because it's just a list, and that's quite nice. So last sort of slide, how are we doing this? So this is sort of the big picture. So we've got the Litmus package that provides assessments. We've got litmus.scores, that's a scoring function. The idea being that every person that uses this Litmus would have a different set of scoring functions. Okay, so they can have whatever they want, but it's decoupled. So we're sort of taking away that discussion of how do we treat licenses? Well, you can treat licenses however you want to treat your licenses. You know, it's not a big deal. It's up to you. We've also got packages for doing report generation. So the output of scores goes into report generation, that sort of stuff. We've got a whole bunch of stuff on containers. So we're running things like Ubuntu Pro, Red Hat Linux / Rocky Linux, running things like vulnerability scanners in these containers. And then we've got a Litmus app that we're developing that's essentially going to be an interface to sort of thousands of these assessments. So a big picture, and by big picture, I'm thinking February time, we'll have this hooked into Diffify. So we maintain a package or a service called diffify.com that allows you to compare two different packages. So essentially that runs every 3 or 4 hours, checks what's different on CRAN, and then does some updates. And so we'll just sort of stick in Litmus here, automatically run these packages and get the output and be able to have an app that's got all the assessments that we want. Why are we saying why is the title assessment as a service or validation as a service? So what we aim to do is we aim to provide people with the tools. So if you want to do it yourself, great, have fun, knock yourself out. Or we hope that we can provide a service that it's just not worth people's while, right? You know, so if it's sufficiently easy, simple, straightforward for us to work with a company, then actually we can do it for you. We can do the validation part, we can do the remediation part, we can help provide scores and reports, and it's far less effort because we're doing it at scale. Again, that initial slide of it's not just pharmaceutical companies that are interested in this, it's finance, it's governments, and it's even academics and those sorts of industries as well. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions, but I think Doug's planning questions at the end. So feel free to ping me in the chat or email me. So thanks. Doug.
Thank you so much, Colin. Really impressive work. I got to see a little behind the scenes glimpse at what Colin was working on. It was really cool stuff. So thanks for sharing all that work. What I'm going to recommend is people that have questions for Colin or are inspired by something that Colin mentioned, take a little note for now. We're going to go through our three presenters real quick, and then we'll circle back and you'll have an opportunity to ask Colin, Nick, or Andre about their various initiatives. So Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doug. Just one moment and I'll share. Now everything's frozen. Sorry, I'll be 1 second. I've had a little bit of a last minute technical issue, realizing Zoom wouldn't work on my work laptop, but hopefully that is showing up slides for
Yeah,
now.
we're seeing it. Looks good.
Okay, fantastic. So I guess for anybody that doesn't know me then, I'm Nick Crane. I'm the software engineering lead of the open source enablement team at Novartis. And part of my job involves looking after our processes and tools for people requesting packages to be added to our statistical computing environment, including like the risk assessments that we do there. So what I'm going to be chatting to you about today is a recent project I've been working on where we've been looking at adopting risk metrics. So this project is partway through. And, there's still some things to figure out, but I'm going to be chatting a bit about why we're doing it, what we had before, some of the things that we still want to know more about, and hopefully more about kind of how we're interested in contributing kind of more to risk metric and kind of similar tools. Okay. So for a bit of context then, at Novartis, we have an internal package called Brave that we've been using for quite a while now for conducting risk assessments. In terms of the history of Brave, I think it was started around the time risk metric kind of was being developed as well. And similarly, it's based on a lot of the functionality is based on the kind of the white paper that was put out, I think 2018, talking about kind of risk assessments and that approach to validating our packages. And we do have a lot of overlapping functions with risk metric. So recently we were considering, what do we want to do? Do we want to put Brave out into open source? Do we want to consider adopting risk metric or something else? And we've ended up with this kind of approach that is kind of a little bit of a mix of both. So what the path we've decided to go down is, well, thinking about it then, the key difference really between Brave and risk metric is that we take a hierarchical approach to risk assessments. So in other words, if a package passes our low risk assessment, then it's low risk. If a package doesn't pass the low risk, but then passes one of the medium ones, then it's medium risk, and then so on. And then we have high risk packages where people need to write kind of extra tests to go along with them. So that is kind of one of the big differences in our approach. But in terms of the way that we actually kind of get the data for those metrics, there are a huge amount of similarities. And it didn't necessarily seem worthwhile to put code that is doing the exact same thing kind of out there. And thinking about as well, how as an organization we engage with open source, we're really passionate about open source. We really want to be engaging with the community and getting involved and help with things. So what we decided is the best approach for us was to take the risk metric, the functions in it, which are collecting the data about packages, and integrate those into Brave. If we want to put our money where our mouth is, and we're saying that for one of the ways that a package is low risk is the fact that that code has been out there and has a lot of community exposure. This just seemed like a logical step to take. And another thing we want to do as part of this as well is that we do have actually some functionality that exists in Brave but not in risk metric. So in the spirit of being good open source, kind of citizens, to contribute some of those features back upstream to risk metrics. So another thing we'd like to do is just have a discussion really about which of those don't exist and whether those would be of use. Okay, so as part of this process then, one of the things we did was compared functionality that exists in both. And we kind of found in the end that some metrics, we got exactly the same results. So for the download calculations, as much as we use 6 months rather than 12 months, and it could be arbitrary which one to use, effectively, it didn't change any of the final decisions that we made. Some metrics were a little bit different. So for counting how many reverse dependencies a package has, we actually do recursive reverse dependencies where I believe risk metric doesn't. So again, that's an interesting thing that it'd be interesting to see community discussions around, which people use, what people find more useful. But overall, a lot of things were pretty similar. There were a few differences, and I'll go into those in a moment. But generally, the idea here was that the first bit of our roadmap, the first bit of this journey, was to start adopting some of these functions. So that's kind of ongoing at the moment. And I've actually been working on that this week. So if some of these slides are out of date, that will be why. Okay, so let's have a look at the next one. So I mentioned a moment ago, we'd also like to think about kind of if there's any of our features that we could contribute back to risk metric. Now, I've looked through a lot of the risk metric code base, although I will admit that some of these may already be in there, but I'm not sure. So one of the criteria that was in the white paper as something that could signify a package is low risk is the idea of, is this package part of base, recommends, tidyverse, or imported or suggested by one of those packages? They've got a huge amount of community exposure and generally can have a very high quality. There are the two middle bullet points here are this idea of, does the package come from a recognizable source or reputable institution? And is the package a low risk support package? So basically, these two are both this idea that we have these institutions, so like POSIT, for example, and we can say, actually, most of the packages that come out of POSIT, due to kind of the standards there and things like that, can be classified as low risk. Similarly, with this low risk support package, this is a list of packages that don't have any statistical functionality. Now, it seems potentially problematic to say, okay, we have this list and everybody must use our list, but having the functionality for somebody to input their own list and calculate a metric that way, could be useful. And also, I think we've got a few metrics potentially for bioconductor packages that aren't in risk metric, but I'm not too sure about that one. And another one that we've got as well is looking at code coverage. So we do a little bit of work kind of looking at the code coverage results that have been uploaded to kind of these code coverage services rather than just running it every time, because that can be kind of quite tricky in some cases. So again, we're kind of in the early bit of this process. So there's questions that I've got that I can probably answer, to be honest, by just getting to the next step and looking at trying to contribute some things back to risk metric. But just in terms of what we're thinking about at the moment, in terms of what we need, I guess for us, we definitely would like to get just a better understanding of the project and how it moves. So for example, in terms of if we were to kind of make a change or want to contribute that upstream, how many folks are there around looking at kind of reviewing PRs and doing code reviews, just so we can kind of factor it a little bit into kind of when we're planning work around this, but also how we can contribute to that. So there might be areas like bug triage that we can get involved in. And again, I know, with open source, you can kind of just jump in on that. But again, this is more me kind of saying, I just want to personally get a better understanding of that. Oh, okay. And then as well, so when Doug asked me to put together this presentation, he also asked if we had any suggestions for things to change. And I think one of the things, and again, I'm quite new to the package, but one of the things that I found a tiny bit more challenging when trying to kind of dig into some of the differences that we did find between our results and ones from Riskmetric was just that some of the internals of the code, you have to get quite into layers within layers within layers to really figure out kind of what's going on. And just for me as kind of lead engineer on my team, I think it feels a little bit complicated and it might be tricky to hand that over to a junior engineer. So whether that would be some simplification or even just developer docs would probably be the easiest solution there. Just sort of mapping out a bit more where things are, then I think that could be something that would be a massive help. And obviously we'd be happy to get involved if that was of interest there as well. Okay, so I realize I've talked at 1,000,000 miles per hour to get through things. But yeah, that's it. So I guess just to conclude then, yeah, we're in the process of adopting Riskmetric, literally ongoing right now. And we're really just keen to see where we can get more involved and what we can do. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. I have some notes as follow-up, so I'm biting my tongue, waiting until the end. I'm already seeing some commonality with some of the stuff that Colin shared, so I think we have some good trends kind of like bubbling up through these. Our next presenter will be Andre. Andre, are you ready to hop on?
Yes.
Cool. All right, then I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so let me share my screen. I'm not sure what I'm gonna share now. Okay, cool. That's the right thing.
Cool. Yeah, we're seeing the PowerPoint window, and I'll let you know when you go full screen if we can see it.
Yep. Cool.
Cool. Yeah, we got it.
Okay, so I'm Andre Couturier. I'm the Global Health and Analytics and Reporting Technology. I'm not a developer, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details about how our metrics calculated and how do we get our data through APIs to the different places, CRAN, GitHub, and Bioconductor. Edward and Hugo are both in Europe, and right now today is a holiday and could not attend the meeting. But these are our key leads. So if you do have questions, technical questions you want to ask back, please try to go to them. I think I just wanted to provide goal and context for us. We are in the process of adopting R for our submission, like a lot of other pharmas in this world. So we need to create an environment. We're pretty late compared to others in the game, I would say. But then we realized we needed to also assess our environment, and it's pretty different than what we're doing with SaaS, where we buy something, we install, and it's ready to use. Now we have 21,000 packages to choose from, and we sort of need to have an idea of what's the quality of these packages is. We definitely were happy when we realized, hey, wow, there's already a lot of people working on this on helping actually the community adopt R, and RiskMetric came up, and then we tried it out, and we ran into a few issues. So it started our project which I'm gonna discuss afterwards. But our goal at the end of the day for us by joining open source is to get faster, successful submission, to speed up our approval so the treatment can reach a patient faster. I think that's a shared goal across everyone that's around here. And then we do believe that adopting and contributing to the R open source ecosystem will allow us to reach that goal faster and reduce our overall cost through shared development and standardization. But it does come with some concerns in terms of vulnerabilities, confidentialities on the security side, on the legal side. Is the source code under a non-permissive license, and GPL license are, copyleft kind of license. So what are the implication of this? Is our IP, and then we have our lawyers looking at this, and our IP folks looking at, how do we securely use R in our work. And then operational is a package maintained by an active community. A lot of the things that RiskMetrics raised and created metrics for. Does it follow good programming practice? Is it sustainable? Is the package of good quality? The maintainer's response time on issues is something that I think is also important. I was listening to a talk yesterday, and they mentioned that SaaS may not be responsive, but we're talking about also open source and volunteering. So are we gonna get also high response time to answer issues? I'm raising the question, not necessarily. And then is there an increased audit risk, because that would actually delay the process along the way? And are we all going to strategically align? Should we? Can we? and we don't seem to be able to align on TLF. So and then I also see a lot of siloed open source work where organization push something out, but there's already something else existing that's pretty similar. There's a lot of overlap. 21,000 packages. I think there's a lot of overlap in all of this. So how do we pick and choose also the right packages for doing the work? Well, the button doesn't work. There you go. Okay, so essentially we as we had the need, right? So we wanted to have a working package that provided us with an assessment of the risk to set up our first environment. We started to create our own package, which we definitely want to open source, and we had the green light to do so. And we wanted to have certain things that were not necessarily available, like the ability to modify certain metrics. I believe, for example, there is a metric about the number of packages available, the number of dependencies for certain packages, and the more dependencies, the more the riskier the package is. I think is the rationale. But there's a fixed number. There's I think it's 5 or 15. I can't remember what the number is. But what if I want to change that? Do I need to go in the code? Is it hard-coded? Is there a parameter available to me to make that change? Because at the end of the day, Sanofi is needs to report to Sanofi's QA. And then Sanofi's QA needs to, help us decide what is the right metrics to decide. So we wanted to have a few more extended features. So we built a new package with core metric, including the R command checks, the unit test coverage, composite coverage of dependencies, more on documentation metric, availability of vignettes or document, documentation, new tracking examples, news tracking examples, etc. Dependency metric, package dependency, reverse dependency, but also a by function traceability metrics and test description to test and match to test pass fail. So, and we wanted something simple to call. So you provide the package name and the version name, and we built behind the scene an API to fetch information directly from CRAN and GitHub. And or you can also use tar files for locally stored. You can use locally stored tar file, whether you download them or if it's for internal packages, etc. So essentially, the package will execute the following task. You upload the source package, rmvlog file and or tar file. You unpack the tar zip files. You install the package locally. You run the code coverage. You run the traceability metrics. You run the R command checks, and then you run the assessment metric, and then you get nice resulting information that we actually turn into a JSON file later on to put in our own database with the versions, with the timestamp, and with the R environment, the R version, the Linux system behind the scene, etc. So we keep all of these information, including dependencies, including the reverse dependencies, and we do calculate a risk score at the end of the day, where we can obviously also modify the weights attached to each of the the different metrics that we have. And then we have this traceability matrix with all the exported functions and the coverage percentage, where we feel this could highlight sometimes, one specific function that may or may not be well covered by test. So the API essentially goes and fetch information from CRAN, latest version of the tar file, and or historical archive version packages. And then you get number of contributors, also GitHub location, bug reports, and number of dependencies. Also the licensing, which is also an important piece of this equation. And then from GitHub, you get further different types of information. There's overlap, but you get further things. And then that's how we store all of this information. And we also have a database behind the scene, and we're building a front end to extract the information and make the information easily accessible to our users. So this is what we've done. I think the way we want to also contribute is by raising questions, ideas. You spoke about governance. How do we govern those metrics? How do we decide? How do we make them expandable or adaptable for each organization? How to modify them? How to raise a new metric? I like something like in the case of dependencies, I'm more interested in whether or not I have a high risk dependency to my package than the count itself. So how do I bring this, and how do we discuss and judge whether or not that's a good metric to bring? And I don't have, and I hope we will have the answers to those questions.
Thanks so much, Andre. It's definitely some really cool use cases here, and I'm really encouraged just by the consistency of people's approaches. Like I know that there's differences in some of the details of how everyone's working through this challenge, but it seems like the architecture is fairly consistent across all three, and that gives me a lot of that's encouraging to me, and that I see a lot of opportunity for coming together on at least a few of these architectural details, kind of like solidify the way that they all can share a common foundation. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time here for anyone on the call that had questions coming out of any of those three discussions. We can maybe take 5 to 10 minutes here to do a little bit of Q&A, if that's okay. Like I mentioned at the start of the call, because of the way the moderation in these workshop settings goes, you'll have to raise your hand if you want to ask your question. If you don't feel comfortable coming off mute to ask a question, you can drop it in chat, and I'll be happy to moderate and ask questions on your behalf. So yeah, if you had any questions, feel free to drop them. I think there was even a couple that came up during the talk. And I think the first one, there's one that I spotted, was for, I think, Nick. And this was a question. Eric, you're welcome to come off mute if you want to ask your questions yourself. Otherwise, I'll jump in and just read them out for you.
Yeah, I can
Go for
ask.
it.
And it wasn't necessarily just to Nick, though she sort of mentioned it, but the question I posed was on the tidyverse. I think everyone here accepts the tidyverse as low risk. However, and Colin touched on this in his talk, if one of your requirements for low risk is stability, the tidyverse may actually fall out of that, as they have great SDLC practices and they're a professional shop. However, over the last couple of years, you take something as fundamental as dplyr, and verbs have changed over time, and we sort of accept that. But from a stability perspective, and it's given clinical trials long runtime, your verbs using gather probably don't work anymore because everything got changed, and I think that might raise, and I'm not saying tidyverse is anything but low risk, but just it highlighting one of the complexities here that it's tricky creating stable software, and I'd be just curious in those that have produced tools where they how they've thought about some of these maybe minutia. Maybe this is too much of a minutia, but
I think that's a really good question, though. I feel like for us, the change isn't necessarily massively kind of relevant, just because the way that we manage our computing environment is that we have these locked bundles, and when things are being, we'll put out certain versions of packages. And my understanding is that, that study and the analysis being done on it is using that particular kind of bundle of packages. So we don't really have concerns there about the packages changing and then analyses we've done before getting different results, just because that is kind of a separate bit of our process, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I'll just, I guess, segue this, because these kinds of questions raise the existential question of like, what do we really need to validate? And are we really do we need better mechanisms for reproducibility? Because, that's at the end of the day, what matters more than I think just an absolutely locked down air gapped or EC2 instance so that I can, run my one trial or something.
That makes sense. And just to add one little thing, and then I'll let somebody else talk. I think as well, that's a really good point, because it's raising the question of like, what do we mean by validation? As in, for me personally, when I'm thinking about our risk assessment, I'm thinking just about risk assessment, because our validation process has so many other components, like checking things are installed and the tests are running. And, if people are using certain code on trials, there'll be other bits of verification around the code and things like that. So for me, this is just about quantifying things as low, medium, and high risk. At the same time, there's so many other things that do need to come into validation. So I'm trying to pull them apart, but I know it's not always possible depending on the question.
There are a couple of hands raised. Mike, I'm not sure. Hope maybe the moderators give you permission to come off. Cool.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you.
Back to, I understand where Eric's coming from in that question about tidyverse. But can we agree that when we're talking about low risk, we're talking about for a particular snapshot, right? So the fact that the tidyverse verbs are changing over time, yes, that's fine. But I think that Posit and the tidyverse developers manage that in a very considered and thoughtful way, and they flag up what's happening to users. I think when we're talking about tidyverse, I'm thinking of it in terms of, for this particular snapshot date, that we're going to then assess or look at the risk scores for that snapshot and for that collection. And I think it's, given the way that they manage those packages, I think that to me puts them as low risk. One question that we did have internally around that was, if we are marking tidyverse as low risk, would that be all of the tidyverse, or just the ones that load when you do library tidyverse plus their dependencies? Because there are maybe some fringe parts of the tidyverse that are quite new and as yet kind of less tested.
I think, I mean, I think your comment about for a snapshot makes sense abstractly, but I wonder if it really will work that way in practice, right? Like, does that mean you're creating like a new validated environment, because you had to update some package because of a bug fix? Like, the problem I see with that is like, could create a bunch of overhead over time, because part of this is like, well, we want open source because it's dynamic, right? But if we're going by snapshot, I wonder if that creates a conflict. I don't know, but that's like my devil's advocate position.
I also had a similar thought, if I can interject here. And then Arthur, I see your hands raised, so we'll go to you next. I think that this always raises the existential question of like, whose risk are we trying to measure? And in the case of, well, for a study deliverable, it's a package, it's a thing that exists as like a concrete analysis at a given point in time. So like, whether or not the tidyverse is going to change gather in the next version, or you're transitioning between tidyverse versions, if you're delivering a study analysis package, that's kind of beyond the point of the analysis. Like the risk of it isn't going to change because those tools are what they are. Now there's the other element of risk is like the replicability, using other packages or other versions of the package. If you hand it off to a health authority, they want to reproduce your analysis, and they're going to install slightly different versions of the tidyverse packages to try to do that. Is all of your code going to break because someone's using slightly different versions of packages? Is that the risk we're talking about? Or there's the risk to an enterprise, which is like, if you have a study team that's been on a study for 5 years and they started with tidyverse 0.8, and now they're transitioning all of their code to a new study, 5 years down the road, is there a big risk to you as an organization because they have to adapt all this code to a newer version of the tidyverse packages? So I think what exactly is the risk that we're trying to classify here becomes a really important question. And depending on where you draw that line, you either care about only this version that exists at this exact time that I plan to use it, or you consider like the life cycle and the effects that it's going to have on an organization or the evolution of code. So I think that's always a challenging question. I think people come at that from very different perspectives sometimes. Arthur, do you mind if I hand it over to you?
Hi, everyone. So I work in process development in a manufacturing organization, and it seems from my perspective that largely process development and manufacturing groups are significantly further behind on adopting R than clinical people. For the presenters or anybody else, I was just wondering if their companies are validating and using R resources in a manufacturing process development setting, in a CGMP setting, and if they know if validation looks any different in this sphere.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead, Colin.
Manufacturing, I'm not sure, but governments, yes, which is sort of, they have different idea of what they want validation to mean. So validation there is they might have annual reports that have to be correct. They have to be reproducible. They can't suddenly get the GDP figures wrong for a particular country because that's catastrophic. But then they also have a whole bunch of other departments that want to mess about with R. As long as it's safe and secure. They're not, they don't really have to get to the details of is it 80% code coverage or not. It's almost buyer beware, provided it's safe and secure. And the manufacturing clients that we do work with, we've not started in that process yet, but they are not in a regulated industry, but the same sort of ideas and concepts work. And by manufacturing, I'm thinking of electronics here. So that's
well, I'm specifically talking about like pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Right. Yeah. So that's so I suppose my view is always moving away from that single source of you either have these validated packages or not, but actually having a range of what you're trying to do, whether it's the production environment where everything has to be safe, secure to the nth degree versus the experimental research part. Well, still should be valid, but not at that range.
I think that might be, if you want to connect through the R Validation Hub, we can try to find other people that are kind of trying to address that specific question also with you. I think that's a little beyond at least the general kind of people that we tend to attract to the project. But
Right.
I think that there's a handful. It's not like you're definitely not the first to come from that perspective. But I might need to try to connect you with some other like-minded folks.
Yeah, I can try following up with you later.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds good.
Mm.
I'm going to pause the questions there. This is definitely not the end of the discussion. In some ways, this is just the start. And maybe just doing a time check. We have about 45 minutes left, so we're a little behind my anticipated schedule, and that's totally fine because I think the conversation has been great so far. What we're going to do next is we're going to hop into a whiteboard that is going to let us kind of map out what we see as some of the key takeaways from the discussions we just heard, or other thoughts that you want to bring to the fore to kind of like seed conversations for the teams going forward. So we're going to start. I'd like to spend a few minutes here before we start kind of really hashing out the nuts and bolts of how we think that these tools could be evolved. I'd like you to just think about what are the things that you want users of these tools to be saying. You might be a user of this tool, and in that case, what if this tool was meeting all of your needs, what do you want to be able to say about it? And let's just start at that high level. Think about, put yourself in the shoes of someone who's enthusiastic to be jumping into this ecosystem. And so you can see the link here. Maybe I could ask someone to copy that over and drop it into the chat. And then that'll make it hopefully easier to navigate to. You'll be dropped into, I'm already seeing plenty of people hopping in. This is awesome. And so if we can start, the middle sections are a little, I tried to lock them, but if you're really enterprising, you can get around that. But I'd like to direct everyone's attention over here to kind of this testimonials area. And over here, we'll just start writing out snippets to try to kind of capture the emotion that we'd like kind of the tools to capture. So I populated one here. You can, take a little moment to kind of like familiarize yourself with the platform. And you can grab that, copy and paste it, and you can add in your own kind of like testimonial here. So you can just double click and type out whatever you'd like. And I can just maybe make a bunch of these. You can start populating them however you'd like. Feel free to kind of, have at it. This is our place to kind of like lay out ideas. We'll take it a little easier on the conversation, but if you have an idea that really sparks kind of something you're proud of, a contribution that you think is important to highlight, feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, kind of talk through what you're thinking. I'm seeing a few people adding in text. That's good. I have no reason to implement it separately myself. I love it. Yeah, that's my goal too. I'm going to copy a few more of these in. And you could just, if you want to, you can just double click on it to start adding some text. Cool. I'm just going to keep reading some of these out because I think it's great to see how what people's aspirations are for the project. So one, I am feeling positive about being part of the industry agreed standards and their implementation. Yeah, I think that's an amazing goal. If we can get to a point where not only are we happy with the tool, but also we're comfortable with the way the industry sees the tool and the way the regulators most importantly see the tool, I think that's an amazing goal to reach for. I trust the metrics and can use them to support my process. Yeah, absolutely. I think trust is a big piece of this. I'm reminded of Colin's discussion about no guessing. And I think guessing in this context might be make it more difficult to trust some of the output. So that might be something we need to consider moving forward. My company should be refining or customizing a common strategy rather than developing from scratch. I like that one too. And full disclosure, I work at Roche, and we're developing this while risk metric was also, I was simultaneously developing risk metric at the time. And there's just things that ended up being expedient for us as a company. So that's always a challenge, is like, ideally the tools are there and they make it easier than the alternative of making your own. And even being a developer on it, that was sometimes difficult. Yeah, okay. This is a good question also. How do we go from start to finish with package validation standardization when companies all make their own process? Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think, at least from, maybe if I can reframe that in terms of like an aspirational goal, I would love to see the discussions about how all these different flavors of standardization look across companies so that we can expose the right levels of flexibility within the package. So we've had a few companies reaching out and letting us know when a metric is interpreting something in a way that they're not necessarily comfortable with. And then we try to like hammer out, okay, what can we do either to make that something toggleable or customizable? Where should that customization live? How much legwork should be required on the part of the user to kind of like tweak things? I think that's definitely a challenge. And part of that is just making sure that the conversations get elevated. Question, I guess to the team, to the risk metric team, I'm assuming, are you seeing companies treating their validation process as proprietary information instead of being willing to share these processes with one another? I can only speak to my experience, and anyone else from our validation hub that wants to speak up, or other companies that might have insight into this. I think generally people are pretty open with this. And actually we have a series of 8 case studies on the R Validation Hub website, or the pharmaR.org website, where we've had a number of companies be quite transparent with their process. So I think we made a lot of progress in terms of people being comfortable opening up about that. All right, I'm really happy with the number of statements we have collected here. I think this has been really fruitful, just to kind of like get our heads in the right place for this activity. So I'm going to unlock this whole section here, and we can now start populating specific features or capabilities. So you'll see that these are cool, and I was able to already see a bunch of notes being added in. This is looking great. Let's stick with this for another 10 minutes or so. So we'll go until about 12:40, and then we'll think a little bit about prioritization and next steps. I'm just gonna comb through. You can already see I went through and populated a few of these with some of my own thoughts, just trying to kind of seed things a little bit, make it easier to copy and paste a few ideas. I'm seeing a few discussions in the sidebar. So if you have other thoughts that pop up that aren't necessarily slotting nicely into any of these categories, always feel free to get those ideas on paper, add them to the sidebar. We'll consider those. Those might seed future discussions in our Validation Hub community meetings, or other ideas to kind of inform the strategy of the team.
Hey, Doug, one quick thing I thought might be helpful is how do you navigate this? For some reason, it's hard for me to go to the right. I was just trying to figure out if there's a trick to that, or if...
for me, it's middle mouse drag. So hold middle mouse and drag, kind of like pans around. If you are finding that difficult, if you're on like a trackpad, I don't know what that would look like, but you can always use this hand symbol at the top and kind of grab and move around.
That's what I was looking for.
Cool.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this platform I like because it's like an open source project, and of course, at the R Validation Hub, we are big fans of open source. But it's definitely not as polished as some of the like enterprise products. So thanks for entertaining our open source enthusiasm. Cool. I'm really liking some of the details in here, and I'm also going to add in some of the notes that I took during some of the presentations. I really liked Colin's no guessing. I think that's a really good motto. At least no guessing, maybe by default, or you know, maybe we can find a way to accommodate a few use cases, but I like this idea of like a no guessing execution mode.
Hey, Doug, is there a way to put in a text box that adapts to the text within it?
I don't think it'll resize, but I think the if you copy one of these, they should do it. If you just
Perfect.
create a square, I'll show you on the screen. You have to right click. How did I do this before? Or if you create text, some kind of text, and then you right click, you can say wrap text in container, which is a little hidden. Yeah, and then you can, it should resize with you. So yeah, there's a few little tricks I had to learn to kind of get this all going. And yeah, I'm sorry that everyone has to kind of like get up to speed real quick. If you copy and paste one of the existing ones, hopefully they're already set up for you that way. Yeah, I like this collaboration with health authorities for metric recommendations. That's a great idea. The difficulty is always getting them in the room, but I think that's something we should put a little more attention toward. Yeah, this is really good. I mean, the repository thing is a challenge because, like we mentioned earlier, how you define risk is very contextualized. Risk can be something that only cares about whatever set of packages you happen to deploy or use in an analysis. But when you have a repository, something that's evolving, how do you manage things like updates, additions, and removals? Yeah, that's a challenge we've been thinking a lot about.
I got a question for you, Doug. So in terms of like the successful submissions to the FDA for these pilot programs, have you guys started to define those packages used in that process as low risk to like standardize, or is it still, since it's an ever evolving landscape and these packages are changing, then that really has no impact, so to speak, in terms of your process or anything like that?
Yeah. There's a couple ways of looking at it. I tend to, my personal preference, and I'll let Aaron, I'm coming to you in just a second about your package listings. But my personal preference is to not necessarily use filing success as a risk metric or a risk indicator itself, because it ends up being a little tautological. Like it's a self-reinforcing metric, right? Like you kind of lose if a package degrades in quality, but it was on a previous study, like how does that impact the metric itself. So instead, I tend to prefer this kind of style where like everything you know about a package can be kind of like derived from first principles, I guess. And that then kind of can inform these things. However, there's, especially if you're like a smaller company, deriving all of these things might be a big lift, and it's much easier to go look at what some other company has done. And for that, Aaron, are you available to hop on a call and talk about the package listings?
Hi, yeah, I'm here. Yep.
Cool, cool. Yeah, do you want to talk about the work you've been doing with the listings?
Yeah, I've just been having some conversations with a few folks. We kind of publicize the notion of, companies starting to share their package listings at PositConf this year, specifically at the Iron Pharma Summit. That was an in-person meeting. And yeah, there's a lot of folks who are very interested in doing that either publicly, which we've seen a few people do so far, namely like Roche shared, and Novartis, and forgive me if I'm forgetting others, but there's also some other folks who were interested in sharing, but maybe they didn't want to put themselves out there in such a way, so they just shared their list internally with the R Validation Hub. So let's just just in a CSV or Excel file, and so that our teams can sort of analyze that data and use it in a useful way. So like basically start to draw some commonalities between everyone's lists. And also helpful for, potentially for the repositories group, who could use that information to, I don't know, as they're sort of working through some package filters, to understand like, what packages are, represented in this, list as they start to play with different thresholds for different metrics. So that's kind of where it's at right now. We did have hopes to sort of create like an onboarding like site or page on our website, but we never got around to doing that for folks who are interested in sharing their lists with us. But yeah, right now we can certainly manage it just through like a conversation. If you are interested in sort of jumping on that bandwagon and seeing what other people are up to.
Yeah, I think that'll be a really cool resource once we get there. And yeah, we're still a lot of the reason that hasn't been totally publicized yet is because we need to work with individual companies to make sure that they are satisfied with the way that the information's getting out there, and that they have kind of like the right level of control, because it does kind of put the companies, just disclosing some information about these companies that they have, they might consider sensitive in some ways. So we're just trying to be
Right.
really responsible about how that all gets shared.
Right. I think that for me, like, kind of goes back to this idea of, do they consider their package validation process or the packages that they have validated as proprietary information or trade secret, or is that something that they're willing to share? And you're like you're saying, like different levels of comfortability of companies and kind of that threshold. So I love it. I think it's going to drive that conversation forward, which I love. So
Yeah. The flip side of that, the thing that maybe makes me like the culture that I want to make sure that we handle responsibly is that I want to avoid a situation where, because all the companies are using like some set of tools, like the blinders get put on for the rest of the ecosystem, and everyone just kind of like locks in on some set of tools, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
So I like the power of R is that it's this like dynamic ecosystem, very extensible, and that's something I want to make sure that our the way that we provide tools kind of reflects that ethos. So yeah, it's something we're trying to handle with care.
That's good to hear. That's great to hear, Doug. Thanks.
All right, I'm seeing a lot of good stuff in here. If anyone wants to raise a hand, come off mute, talk about something that they thought was a really nice kind of addition to one of these tools or something they're excited about, you're more than welcome to. In the meantime, I'll just start talking through what we'll do as kind of the next little activity for this. So at the very top here, we have this little star. And I'm going to ask people to copy and paste 5 of these. And you can go and star some of the notes that you think are like really high priority. So I'll just make as many of these as I can, and people can grab them. You can star one thing 5 times. You can star, you know, 5 things once, whatever you want. Make it a little smaller. And yeah, if there's something you really want to call our attention to, grab one of these stars up here and go drag it over to something you want us to focus on.
Doug, can I plug something? This is Mike Smith.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Mike.
So the Fuse open source tools for clinical data analysis team is presenting at the Fuse EU Connect about our paper, which is essentially answering frequently asked questions about R. And part of that is around the kind of validation reproducibility. How do we document our confidence in packages or in results generally? So we have a GitHub. We are writing the manuscript with Quarto, and we're aiming to do all this out in the open. So on that site, there are discussions, and folks can jump in that discussion, ask questions, tell us how do you do it, or what matters to you, and essentially steer the direction of that manuscript. Because what we would like to do is to get kind of the opinionated people who can contribute to that discussion and steer the answers to these questions, so that when you are reading this as an individual, as a data scientist, you can look at it and go, I see this as being best practice for industry or across a number of different companies. But also, if you're talking within your company, your organization, and trying to influence to use R, hopefully these answers will help you to initiate that discussion.
That sounds amazing. Do you want to drop a link to this initiative? Is there something you could drop? Perfect.
I know that a lot of people have already contributed, but if you haven't yet, please do come and be part of that conversation.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Mike. Cool. I'm seeing a few that really seem to be crowd favorites over here. So on the repo side, thinking about how the evolution of the cohort evolves and how we can manage validation. I'll maybe just seed a few thoughts in this space because it's something that we have given a little bit of thought to. I know Colin said she had to drop. She leads the work stream. So I'll be sharing some news from what she's been working on. So one of the things we're considering here is that this repository, we're hoping to match CRAN and evaluate packages as they get updated on CRAN. And so I'm also eager to see what this looks like with Colin's Diffify updates. What we're hoping to do is that when packages are updated, we're also reevaluating their reverse dependencies. So that is probably the primary place where packages would be affected by changes to a package ecosystem. Now, the changes to a validated environment are also another level of that. So like if you were to, for instance, upgrade your OS version, that's something where we would be planning to reevaluate all the packages and recalculate metrics across all of them. Something like that could affect any package, so that there's not really a clear way of narrowing the scope. Hopefully that happens in a fairly regulated way. So we're hoping to have some pretty tight controls on the lifecycle management of the environments that we're testing against. And in an ideal world, trying to establish those as somewhat of like industry standards, so that if industries or industry participants, be it large pharmaceuticals or smaller companies, if they want to use that as like the basis for their own analysis, the base environment for their own analysis, then hopefully that would make it easier to pull these metrics. But it's a big challenge, and I think one of the challenges we're going to be facing is how do we budget for that amount of compute load, and how frequently can we actually realistically do this? On the risk metric side, I see a 3 stars in stop, and which is always kind of interesting. Not to say it's bad. I don't mean to give that a negative connotation. I think it's great to identify things that we can stop. So can we agree on commonalities on metrics outside of scores so that we can harmonize and collect the attributes? I love it. I think that there's that's really somewhere where I'd love to see a lot of the consensus starting to happen. And if we can move the scoring stuff off to our whatever this decision-making package ends up looking like, then then we can put the logic of how that happens over in here or in our government's team, and really start separating those goals. Simplify internals, 2 stars. Yeah, that's something we've heard a couple times, and a lot of the complexity of the internals rests on my shoulders, so I'll be the first to own up to how complicated things are. We invested a lot of energy early on in trying to like swallow a lot of the complexity, and hopefully make it easy to contribute to. But practice is seeing it put into practice by all these other consumers of the product. That's really where like that's the proof in the pudding, right? So if people are still finding that to be too like inaccessible, then we haven't met that goal, and we should find a way to make that a more realistic and simpler path. Anyone else have a pet issue that they would like to highlight? I want to steal all the thunder.
So I think I wrote somewhere, try to, can't remember now, get metrics evaluated at CRAN level. Maybe as part of a package submission process. Now you're saying you want to do this in a separate place, but wouldn't it be easier if everyone was... Yeah, I understand that some of the metrics are dependent on the environment. However, counting the number of dependencies, whether there's documentation, blah, 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 a lot of the metrics could also be done there.
I totally agree. We're actually, the repositories group, Colin's done a really amazing job of connecting with a lot of our consortium projects that are working with teams like the CRAN team, and trying to push as much of this upstream as possible, at least working with them to think about how feasible that is. So we totally agree with you. If there is a place where these are generalized, useful ways of looking at packages, that would definitely be the ideal place for it. I think the challenge is probably that what we're looking for, it does end up being a little specific. So there's a little reluctance to maintain those types of features or capabilities, but in spirit, I'm right there with you.
How many packages? So are we going to do the whole ecosystem, or do we intend to also have industry-specific list of package we maintain?
Yeah. My hope my personal hope is to do the whole ecosystem. I think realistically, that's going to be limited primarily by compute resources. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there if the compute resources aren't, or if that's going to be an unrealistic goal. Mike.
Can I throw a curveball in here? Because
Absolutely.
pharma is a big beast. So maybe we need to separate out clinical trial reporting from real world evidence, from biomarker assessment, from everything else. Because otherwise, you know, like the packages we may want for clinical trial reporting may be utterly different from what the real world evidence people want. You know, and that would then, I guess, reduce scope for certain places so that you can say, you know, here is a good starter set for clinical trial reporting, or, you know, here's it's almost like, I guess, the CRAN topic. What do they call it? You know, the
task views. Is that what you're thinking of?
Task views, right. So if you went, okay, here's real world evidence, you know, set that you might want to consider. The difference is, I guess, that clinical trial reporting want a solid base and consistent and not changing every other day. Whereas like biomarkers or you know, folks who work with Bioconductor, they may say, well, actually, I do want the latest, greatest because the information changes every day. You know, I've had colleagues contact me and say, well, you know, I'd like to get hold of this gene expression data from Bioconductor, but it's several gigabytes worth of a package. Can I fold that into the set? And it's like, well, please don't. You know, but that's because the gene expression data they're trying to get at updates regularly. And I think we would wind up chasing our tails if we folded that into the mix.
I think internally, we're looking at a solution like this where we're creating a submission environment, a biomarker environment, and the set of package is completely different. And we want to be just able to have users decide which environment today they want to use because
that's it.
Whatever task they're doing. But that for submission, that's where, you know, I know we have a huge set of packages, but we definitely we're definitely looking at restricting somewhat the overlap of the 7 TLF packages, for example. Standardization because it's a different task also for me, it's industrialization. And if I want to industrialize, I need to be focused and I need to have, you know, a specific set in place.
Yeah, sorry.
I think it's
I was giggling, Andre, because like I'm recalling Nicole's presentation the other day when she said she had 30 packages in her set, and I was like, only 30. That's that's not even half the tidyverse. You know, and we've got a couple of orders of magnitude more than that.
Yeah. I have more than 30, but I want to avoid 7 TLF package for sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'm gonna table this discussion. So if you had other thoughts, please drop them in the sidebar. Andre, if you want to drop, just see the questions that we keep that conversation going in the sidebar. I think that'd be great. I just wanted to focus people's attention on what will be the next steps. So what I would appreciate if people do now is think about how they would like to see things changing going forward. I think a lot of the discussion so far centered around things that are fairly technical or functional behaviors of all these tools. I would also like you to think about things like what maintenance looks like. And I know thinking back to Nick's presentation, talking about like how actively bugs get triaged and how the maintenance of these tools lives on. If some of these features would require, are more about the governance of a tool or the organization of our teams, if they require more discussion to kind of converge on what next steps should look like, please also feel free to drop those types of things in our next steps, because I think those are equally important, and maybe even more important than necessarily the technical pieces would be, how do we get the right people in the right room or in the right issue thread, whatever, wherever the discussions are happening, to kind of move things forward. So expand on ideas, prioritize the things that you think need to be elevated. So the things that probably have the most stars, let's kind of drop them down into next steps. You can see that I started adding like some explicit tasks next to one of them. So if you want to do something like that, you see like a sticky note that's kind of more abstract. You want to lay out what that looks like more concretely. Feel free to add some other kind of like discussion notes. Even if it wasn't your initial sticky note, like it's okay to interpret and riff on people's ideas. Start thinking about, yeah, what would we like to see as actions to come out of today? And I just had a bunch of ideas just to kind of like map out the spectrum of things that you might consider. So things like what user stories we might need to consider moving forward. What does maintenance look like? How are we onboarding new contributors? The documentation, whether that could be improved. If it would make it easier to contribute if there were, things were caught or encouraged in CI/CD to kind of keep the code base more accessible. If I think Nick even mentioned like maybe one of these things would even just be solved by having a contribution guide. So is that something that we should really focus on? Or having an architecture overview? I think that might have been mentioned as well. So if any of those are ideas that resonated with you, please start capturing them, and we'll consider those as actions for the team to take those forward. How would you like the R consortium to help? Are there any specific tasks that might benefit from ISC grant funding? So we are an R consortium project, and I probably should have highlighted that. The R consortium is, the R validation hub operates under the R consortium. We get a lot of support already from the R consortium. So if your company is looking to sponsor our project, you can look upstream of us at the R consortium. That's probably the best place to support our work financially. And we get a lot of great input in terms of the experts that they have on hand already. So we have a lot of cross-pollination with other R consortium groups, and yeah, they're really helpful. We have applied for ISC grants in the past, but generally, a lot of resources are contributed through major pharmaceutical companies that were generally they're willing to donate some amount of headcount to, maybe a partial time or whatever to some of these projects. So that generally, I think just in terms of headcount, where that's not something we necessarily usually need, but certainly as we start to approach things like infrastructure costs, that might be something we need to think about in the future. Mike, you want to give us a plug for the R consortium?
Well, yeah, as a board member, it's my duty. So yeah, if you want to kind of support the working groups, various working groups kind of adjacent to this effort, right? Then persuading your company to join our consortium as a member, big or small, we would love to have you there, because then you can influence the direction of travel here, and keep the lights on in terms of helping Doug and colleagues do all this. The other thing is, I realize that you're dead right, Doug, that there are companies that are essentially giving benefit in kind, and also ideas. And in some respects, it's not just people doing this stuff, but it's your engagement and your ideas and this kind of discussion we're having today that's just as important, because they kind of sit back and wait for other people to solve this, and then I'll just swoop in and I'll cherry pick the bits I like. Well, you get what you get at the end of that process. So it's much better to if you've got an opinion, if you've got an idea, share it, say it loud, let's hear it. The point about ISC funding was if it meant that we could get stuff done more quickly, or if you wanted to pick up things that were working well just now, but we could just do with tightening up in a few areas, ISC can help make that happen. We could fund some development if that was what was needed, but you're right that the kind of later points about when we get to the regulatory or repository, if you need funding for the infrastructure there, that's what an ISC grant could give.
Thanks, Mike. We're closing in on time for today. I don't know if we're going to get immediately kicked out, but I wanted to try to highlight this one in our last moments. What's the best way to stay engaged? First, start by joining our mailing list. That's where a lot of our communication goes out. You can find it at pharmar.org. That's the number one place. We're working on trying to figure out we used to have a Slack. It kind of withered on the vine for a while. It's being resuscitated, but also our consortium is starting to really lean into a lot of the Linux Foundation tools. So the R consortium operates as part of the Linux Foundation. And I've heard mutterings that we might be moving to a Linux Foundation supported Slack. So what we're hoping to do is figure out where that moves in the near future, and we'll let people know on the mailing list where they can start joining in a more kind of like direct conversational manner. Cool. So I'm getting notice that we can keep this running as long as we need, but I want to be respectful also of people's time. So I'll try to wrap up quickly. We might go a couple minutes over. So just in closing, I just want to thank everyone for taking part in this. I think it was really helpful, really productive. Thank you so much to the organizers and moderators for making this happen, even under challenging operational constraints. So thank you so much for making this an encouraging and collaborative environment. I'm going to save all of the work that's gone into this whiteboard that we put together. We'll use this to circle back to all of the different teams that we have and start helping them to design what their next steps will look like. Please get on our mailing list. We'd like to have a more open forum coming up soon, and we're working with the Linux Foundation to figure out what that should look like. Once we have a place that we know will be kind of the central place moving forward, we'll let you know. And please get involved. Definitely check out the repositories that we have. I think Risk Metric is probably the most active, with risk assessment not far behind. So both of those are really great places to have these discussions and start figuring out where you see these gaps. So right now, Risk Metric is a really small team that does a lot of support and tries to manage a lot of community questions and engagement. And I think to some of the points that were raised today about how should bug triage happen, how should maintenance happen, those are things that we probably need more involvement to make those really comfortable feedback loops. So if you're seeing those issues, you're feeling maybe some of those pain points, or you want to see discussions moving along faster, maybe do more code review, we can probably use your experience and expertise to kind of make those things happen faster. So get involved, start poking around at issues. You're welcome to reach out to anyone here if you find us on, I don't know, whatever other platforms. LinkedIn ends up being a good one, since this ends up being a fairly professional affiliated kind of crowd. But if you want to message anyone just to kind of like figure out what's the right way to kind of move things past that point before we have a really designated forum in place, then please pull on whichever threads you can find to kind of push that forward. And I think probably LinkedIn is probably the best, or shooting people emails if you're trying to get more actively involved is a great way. Or open an issue. We're all very accepting of people using whatever channels they can to kind of like realize more involvement. So I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's helped make this happen, especially to our speakers. Colin, I just saw a thank you from you. So Colin, thank you as a speaker. for sharing what you've done, Nick and Andre. I think it was really helpful to see all of the work that's been put into the surrounding ecosystem so we can learn from your experiences. So join our mailing list, participate in repository issues and discussions. We're working on getting this Linux Foundation Slack figured out. And once we know that that is going to be a more permanent home for us, then we'll send out information to the mailing list to let you know how you can hop on. So I'll close there. Any final thoughts from any of the participants? Don't forget to save the chat. Yeah, that's a good point. Is there anything I need to do in particular? I've never tried to save a chat.
Just the 3 dots that on my screen, it would be where it says workshop R validation hub. Look for 3 dots there, and one of the options will be to save the chat. I also just want to point out that if you stayed and you would like the Credly badge, we have provided the link in the chat, and go from there. If you need anything, please please reach out. But thank you guys. Thank you so much, Doug. Thanks for everybody that got to join.